We primarily think of the Christian faith as having to do with salvation from sin and restoring people to relationship with God. And while that is perhaps the center of it, there are a lot of things that are involved in that that may not strike us because they may not really be right there on the surface for us to see. In our session today, we want to look at one of those aspects of Christian living that is affected by the gospel and might be overlooked if we did not force our attention upon it. And we're going to begin by looking at a statement that Paul makes in the 12th chapter of the book of Romans in verse 3. I say to every person among you not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think. Now, most of the time when we read this verse, we are concerned to emphasize that pride needs to be gotten out of people's lives because it just does not lead to the right kind of activity toward each other and toward God. And that is certainly there because Paul says not to think of ourselves more highly. But the point that we want to look at is the last part of the verse when he says we ought to think. There is a way that we ought to view ourselves. We ought to have enough appreciation for who we are to feel good about ourselves. There are several terms that we use when we're talking about this matter of how we feel and think about ourselves. One of them is the matter of self-esteem, self-image, self-concept, self-identity, self-worth, self-acceptance, inner security, psychological strength. All of these terms in the English language get at the idea of what our consideration of ourself really is. Do we consider ourselves significant, worth less? Maybe it's one of these unconscious feelings that we have that we need to let the gospel change and alter for the better. The problem of self-image applies really to everyone, because we all have a hard time getting a good feel for how we should think of ourselves. But there are some of us that have this difficulty more than others. And I think we've all passed through what we usually call the teenage years, when this is especially an important matter, because as we're growing up, we're not exactly sure of who we are yet. We're not exactly sure of our abilities. There are a lot of things that are unclear to us, and among those things is really who we are. And so to young people, but to those of us who are continuing to grow up in years, we have a message that we can get out of the gospel, I think, that will help us have a more appropriate feel for the way we should look at ourselves. And so we're going to try to think about that a little bit in these next few minutes. The first main section of thinking we want to do is in relation to the question of how can we tell what we think of ourselves. You may never have stopped to ask that kind of a question before, but it's a little bit hard to get a hold of, and I have a few homemade ways here, perhaps you could call them, by which we can perhaps get at that question. One of the ways I think that we can recognize a weak self-image is how compelled we feel to get attention. There are some people who do not want to participate in activities if they can't be the boss of it. They do not want to do things for other people unless they get special recognition for them. With kids sometimes we talk a lot about showing off. Now, I think there is a connection between that kind of acting and this matter of low self-image. A person who always feels that he has to be up front, that he has to be leader, that he has to be the person with the say, is someone who really isn't all that confident that other people will accept him in that kind of a role. And he has to keep pushing the point all the time in order to reassure himself that he is in fact the kind of person that other people can look up to, because he's got the sneaking suspicion that he's really not looked up to by other people, and so he tries to be in the lead all the time. It's one of the main weakness behaviors, it seems to me, and we call it attention getting. behavior. But there's another kind of thing that we also can look at, and that is how hard we try to defend ourselves. This we can call defensive behavior. And you can ask yourself, how much does it bother you to be wrong? Do you find yourself wanting to argue a point to the death? You know, you just really can't let the other person win the argument, or you can't admit that there was something you hadn't thought of. Sometimes people can't stand to have their activities questioned. Sometimes we ask them about things, not challenging them particularly, but simply wanting to know why they did such and such, and they don't receive that very well. And I think this kind of derives again from a feeling inside that I am not really a very strong person, and other people have a tendency to look down on me, and consequently I have to do everything I can to prove a point. They're always in competition and in combat with each other. Another one of these is how easily we get offended. Just a couple days ago was out in one of the churches speaking, and afterwards one of the couples in the church was very nice and took me out to their home for dinner. And while we were sitting around talking, they had been talking about a previous person who had come there to speak. And they were a smaller country congregation, and they have a really nice spirit among them. A lot of exchange back and forth between the audience and those who may be leaving, and a lot of participation, and everybody's attentive and all that sort of thing. But they were talking about this one speaker who became offended because he did not get in the pulpit at the time that he was supposed to. And when he finally, the other singing and other things in the worship service had finished up and it was his time, he got up and says, well, I had a sermon to preach, but you know, it's too late now, and got up and walked off. Now, that we call really childish behavior, and we hope that sort of thing doesn't happen in Christian leadership very often. But the sad part is that it happens too often among Christian people because we have not absorbed something of the spirit of Christianity into our daily walk. And I think we can measure then how secure we feel by the tendency of us to get mad. I think anger in an awful lot of the cases is really an indication of fear. And we lose our self-control in the face of fear. Another one of the things that we can look at is how easily we get discouraged. You probably know people who are quitters. They will start projects, and the first time something doesn't go exactly the way it ought to, they're ready to throw up their hands and walk off of the job. And again, I think it's because they're really not confident that they can pull the thing off, and the first indication that something is not going to be easy is taken by them as an indication that they are failing. Another question we can ask is how easily we can compliment other people. I don't know how many of you know this way, but I have run onto people that just cannot give a compliment to someone else. And you wonder what goes on in a person's mind where they can't recognize the goodness in another person. If they've heard a sermon preached, or if perhaps they've heard someone play an instrument, and you are sitting talking about it later, they will never bring up the point of how well it was done or how much they appreciated it or anything like that. Instead, they will tend to try to find some weakness somewhere in it to point out to you instead of giving you their appreciation for the overall impression that the person made upon them. The last of the things we want to mention is a little hard to get a hold of. It's a question of how much time we spend thinking about ourselves. The reason it's hard to get a hold of is because it's a little hard to tell what other people do in comparison to us. And so we don't really know whether we're all that abnormal or not. But I think it's probably not a healthy sign to us. If we're always sitting around wondering about how we're coming across to other people, wondering what other people think of the way we look or the way we have said something, and too great a concern about how we come across to other people is probably not good. Just too much self-thinking, I think, is really not a good, healthy sign. If we get ourselves into a pattern like that, then I think we need to listen especially to the kinds of things that we are going to be talking about here next. I believe it's well for us as well as a next major topic to give a little consideration to how it is that our self-image is formed. Where did we ever get this weakness behavior in the first place? I think one of the most important considerations is the feedback that we get from other people. We don't really know how we look to other people in comparison to how yet others may look to them. And so we try to measure the way they feed back to us and then compare that with the way they feed back to other people, and we make some sort of a comparison between the two things then. So in forming our self-image, it's pretty important what we have fed back to us by others. And there is an expression that is used called the significant others. Now, there are a lot of other people in the world, but there are some that we automatically look upon as our significant others. Normally, this involves the parents of a family, maybe your brothers or sisters, maybe your teacher at school, maybe some other particular friend. What they think about you means an awful lot to you, and how they feed back to you is one of the primary sources then that we use in trying to evaluate ourselves and to see really whether we're all that significant or not. One of the things in the response of other people to us is whether they initiate taking time with us. Time is one of those precious things, and when people are willing to take a lot of it for our benefit, then we read off of that the inference that we must be of some value to them, and in order to be of some value to them, they must think that we are worth taking the time for or bestowing the attention upon. Another thing here is the matter of how other people focus upon us. We have the capacity, we say, of soft focusing things. You just sort of glance at it, and you don't really zero in on it and look it square in the eye. Now, we do that not only with things, but we also do that with people. And those that we really fix our attention on and look in the eye are probably the ones that we regard as important to us. Now, since we find ourselves doing that with other people, then in reading the feedback that other people give us, we evaluate what they think of us by the amount of focused time they give us. If they just sort of walk past us and say hi and really never turn and face us, then we kind of take that as an indication that they consider us secondary. Sometimes when there's a circle of people standing and talking and you walk up, you can kind of tell how that particular group of people feel about you by whether they let you into get some sort of a reading of their feelings about us. And since we don't know really whether we're great or not, we tend to take the evaluation of other people at face value, and if they treat us as dirt, we say, then we will suppose that that's really what we are because we have that impression upon other people. So let's keep in mind that the most important factor that it affects us unconsciously is the feedback we get from other people in determining our own self-image. Now, there's some other things, and we can list those too. I think our ability levels has something to do with our self-confidence and our self-image. If we are in school and we do well in school in comparison to the other ones who are there, then we tend to feel good about ourselves because we can do something well as measured by how other people are able to do it. If we are athletically inclined and we can play games easily and succeed at winning in those things, that is another one of those things that we look at and we say, well, I'm worth something. If we have a mental then or physical abilities, we tend to use those as a foundation for our self-concept. And right along that same line, well, then probably we will feel good about ourselves. But if we think, oh, I'm ugly, I got big ears, or I got a bald head, or I'm a little bit overweight, or I got a big stomach, or my nose is too long, we probably don't feel good about ourselves if we think that our physical appearance is not very acceptable. Sometimes, too, people build their self-concept on the possessions that they have. If they have a nice home to live in, or a good car to drive, or if they have good clothes to wear, that is something that kind of bolsters them up and makes them feel good. And then finally, I think that as we go along through life, our self-image can tend to improve because one of the bases for it is our accomplishments. If we have done things that people acknowledge as significant, and we think they're significant, as those accumulate, we will, for one thing, get feedback from other people telling us that they think that what we've done is a good thing, or it's been helpful, or something along that line. The more we accomplish, the more we seem to have a good feeling about ourselves. And so we want to list that among the things that has to do with shaping our self-image. I really think to a great extent, though, if we can emphasize that matter of how other people feed back to us, it's awfully important. And especially to those of us who are parents, we need to remember that much of this matter of self-image, us at a very young age, perhaps before we are even aware of such a thing as self-image. If we don't spend any time with our kids, if we don't focus on them just one-on-one, if we don't give them encouragement, they are going to they are really not very significant because those who are the closest to them are not making much of an effort to relate to them. We want to focus particularly now on a third major thing, and that is how we can develop a healthy self-image, particularly taking into consideration our Christian resources in doing this. In introducing this part of it, I'd like to come to the board and use an illustration in order to get across some fundamental concepts that we can then use to think about the areas that we can draw upon for our improvement of self-image. I want to put 3 words on the board: action, and now those 3 words are important because I think all of reality can be reduced to these 3 factors. So far as being is concerned, what I have in mind is the stuff that is involved in a given event. In this event of my writing the words on the board, there was the board itself, and there was the chalk, and there was my hand. That's the stuff that was there. And then the action is the motions that I went through as I put the words on the board, and the relationship in this illustration would be my hand connected with the chalk, and it's rubbing on the board to create the words that I wanted to put up there. Now, the stuff of which we are made has something to do with the basis for self-image. Our actions have a basis, and our relationships have a basis in helping us develop a self-image that's good. In regard to the matter of being, we need to remember that we are created in the image of God. One of the implications of that is that we are therefore significant, and there is worth to us. We are not just animals. We are not just electrochemical processes. We are persons. And insofar as we are persons, we are like God. And we are made in such a way that we have primary capacities that He Himself has, and we are made in such a way as we can relate to Him. So, if we think of ourselves as persons created in the image of God, we're going to have a fundamental or ground floor that is higher than what would be if we were just to think of ourselves as basically the same as everything else. It's just that we are this way, and the trees are another way, and the animals are another way. We have been created in God's image to fulfill God's purposes and to relate to Him, and that is significant. Beyond remembering that we're created in His image, however, we can go to this matter of action. Do something. If you want to change or improve your self-image, it's going to have to be done in connection with activity. We have to take initiative. We have to learn not to be passive. The problem with being passive is that we automatically get manipulated by other people. And we may not be consciously aware of it, but we look down on ourselves when we let other people shove us around in ways that that's not necessary to allow them to do. We need to take charge of our lives. We need to do something. We need to live by goals and values, and not just by feelings and by impressions. Feelings are very unstable things. Impressions are the same thing. But when we have values, such as what God tells us about in His Word, and when we have goals, such as those things that God lays out before us, then we will be acting in terms of those things. And we will have a place in all of that. And we will be meaningful in all of that. And because we have done something in connection with His will, one of the results is it's going to lift our feelings about ourselves. The more we sit around and do little, the more we're going to be reinforced in this low self-image. Another thing that I think is especially important for Christianity is that we need to replace law with grace. Or to put it two or three other ways, we need to replace works with faith. We need to replace perfection with growth. Part of the problem with trying to relate to God on the basis of law, any law, is that you have to live the law out completely in every detail to be a legitimate person in relationship to the God who laid that law down. Now, inasmuch as perfection is something that you and I never achieve, even if it were our own standards, if we never achieve them, we'll never have a basis for feeling good about ourselves that could have been founded upon the fact that we had a relationship with God. That's one of the reasons the doctrine of grace and faith is so important, is that our being accepted by a significant other, God, is not based upon our doing everything all the time correctly. Now, we want to do the best we can, but the problem is that we never succeed entirely. And if our worth is going to be based upon perfection, then we're not going to have a good self-concept, and our self-worth is going to be low. So here again, it's this whole matter of action. What kinds of ways of acting are we going to fulfill in order to have something to say about our own self-image? Now, another very big item that has to do with our Christian faith is that we need to convert competition to caring. One of the most important elements in people's image of themselves is how they stack up against other people. If they're smarter than other people, then they want to feel good about themselves. If they're more athletic than other people, then they can feel good about themselves. If they win, then they feel good about themselves. But don't you see that that kind of a setup means that your self-concept is based on a competition situation. You as over against others. You as distinguished from others and distinct from them. Now, competition is not going to work for very many people, because obviously not very many people can be best. So instead of that, the gospel does not call upon us to be best as a basis for feeling good about ourselves. It calls upon us to care about people. In place of putting ourselves over against them, we need to put ourselves in connection with other people, and then we will be helping them and sharing our resources and talent and time and our focusing upon them. And when we see them able to respond and be made happy by our actions, then that gives us a basis for feeling good about ourselves. We also need to change from a material to a spiritual orientation. We need to insist upon measuring ourselves by God's way of measuring us. Too often, people want to measure themselves by things that they cannot control. And a lot of the times, physical things are among those that we cannot control. One other piece of advice, I think, is that we ought to diversify investments. That is, we ought not to put all of our eggs in one basket. We ought to try something new once in a while. We ought to develop a hobby. We ought to avoid the feeling of being locked in to what we already are. And when we do that, I think it will help our image of ourselves. If we go to the diagram that we've been using as the basis for our thinking, our relationship to God and our relationship to others has to do with the personal development that's there. And in our consideration of self-image, I think it's important to see that that's primarily based upon this whole matter of relationship to significant others, to God, and to our Christian brothers. We operate by the principle that a man is a unit, that he is a whole, and all of the parts fit together to form that unified whole. When you add that to the observation that the gospel is directed to us, the inference seems to be that what God says to us in the gospel ought to affect directly or indirectly our whole person. And so we're coming today to look at the matter of psychological strength. Now, the Scripture perhaps does not talk about what we're concerned with in a direct fashion, but many of the things that it does have to say seem to me to have implications for our concern. When we ask the question, how can I cope with life in the most efficient way? And then I look at the Scripture, there seem to be things in there that imply ways of living that will give me strength over and above what I would have if I were living in other ways. We're not really dealing with the question of mental health here, although I think there is even some connection between the gospel and mental health. We're dealing, though, rather with those of us who are typically going about our daily tasks, trying to find the most efficient way to go about them so that life yields to us the satisfaction that God has intended in all of that. As we begin looking at this matter of psychological strength, I thought it might be well to just list some of the kinds of things that we have in mind when we talk about psychological. What does psychological mean? Well, psychological has to do primarily with the way we look at things, with what we call the subjective side of experiences. It's the way we feel about them, more really than what they really are like in and of themselves. And one of the things that's involved is the matter of fragmentation versus wholeness. When we are facing life with the feel that things are just going everywhere, then we don't have a very nice feeling about all of that. We would rather have life have the feel of wholeness to it than a fragmentation. Seem unrelated. Of relevance between one part and another. And that all contributes to a feeling that things are not meaningful in my actions and my deeds and the things I have in such a way as to form a meaningful experience on the whole. Another thing involved in psychological would be the versus purposefulness. Now, we all have had this experience where we just seem to be beating our heads against a stone wall, and the goal seems to lie on the other side of it, and we just can't get there. There are some ways of living that cause us to have that experience more than we might otherwise have it. But we want to have the sense of accomplishment and the sense of arrival at what we have tried. The matter is that of insecurity versus stability. Sometimes we have the feeling that the ground is just ready to fall out from underneath of us. And if that's kind of the unconscious maybe feeling that we have about life, it doesn't make it a very pleasant experience. And so we are looking for something that will give us, or someone that will give us, stability in the sense of things being where they are and being dependable and being strong, a sense of consistency. Another matter is that of disorientation versus having a direction for our lives. Disorientation, you don't know where east, north, west, and south are. It's like being out in the woods and you don't know which direction is home. When you don't have a center to life, when you don't have a direction for life, it does not yield the kind of pleasant experience that it otherwise would have. And then the last thing we might just mention here as an example of psychological matters is that of depression, as over against a sense of joy or rising above our circumstances and having the feeling that things are in hand. Sometimes it is as if we're down underneath looking up at bottom and the whole world is coming down upon us. That's the way we feel about it. Now, we can maybe even say with our minds, I know this isn't true, but that's not the point. The point is how we feel about that sense of overwhelming sadness. Now, the matters of disorientation and fragmentation, depression and frustration, insecurity, these are the sorts of things we are looking at the gospel to give us insight into being able to handle. And so we want to look at some things. And the first group of things we want to look at is, in fact, the nature of God. I think it's important for us to remember the kind of God that we have and to see in Him those things that will provide for us a stability and a strength that will be able to yield a more fulfilling life. The first thing we want to notice is what we could call the oneness of God. The Father, Son, Spirit are at one with one another. They have the same purpose. They have the same nature. They are unique among what people have thought of as gods. And so that has some implications for us. If there is a unity within God, we can see this in contrast to what is called polytheism, where there are perhaps many gods, and they're all doing their own thing, and they're all trying to accomplish their own purposes. They're fighting each other. And if there are a lot of spirits in the world and everything is kind of working against each other, then we are going to have disorientation. We're going to have fragmentation. We're going to have a feeling of inconsistency in the very world around us, in the very ultimate frame of reference for our existence, which is God. We're going to have insecurity because we don't know who we need to go to next and who to please this time and what to do. There's going to be a sense of distance rather than intimacy when gods or the gods are really not in harmony with one another. But in Christianity, we teach that Father, Son, and Spirit are working together to accomplish the common goal, and they have the same values. And as a result, this aspect of the nature of God is going to help us have a better feel for life and going to yield a greater satisfaction out of it. Now, related to this is God's holiness. Perhaps the main element in holiness is that of consistency. Consistency means that we can count on God to be the same tomorrow as He was today, so that we don't always have to be guessing what's going to come up next. And the sense of stability and security that rises out of that is especially fine. Another characteristic of God that's important to us here is what we call His omnipotence, God's all-powerfulness. God is capable of doing all things that are consistent with His nature and purpose. And obviously then that's going to give us a sense of security. That's going to give us a way through the problem of frustration, perhaps, because we can call upon God to assist us in those things that are worthy of His attention. This is one of the things that we might remember when we're dealing with the problem of evil as well, is that God has power to overcome those things that would work against us as we have aligned ourselves with Him. Besides omnipotence, we could also mention omniscience, which means all-knowing. God knows all things. There are not going to be any surprises that jump up in front of Him and catch Him off guard and unprepared to handle. And if that's the kind of God we have, then we who are committed to Him are able to have security again, because we know that He has all things in hand. The last of the characteristics of God we want to mention is that of His love. God cares for us. He's not out there combating us. He's not out there trying to use us and manipulate us. Rather, He loves us. That ought to give us security and a sense of intimacy and closeness that fills out the unconscious desires of us as persons. Beyond the character of God, there are our activities. And we want to concentrate our time here in this session upon those things that the Scripture says to us that we ought to do, how we ought to think, how we ought to spend our time, that we feel have some implications for psychological strength. Now, the first thing we want to talk about is centered in a suggestion that is implied to me, at least, in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 8 and 9. Be serious, be alert. Your opponent, the devil, walks around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to consume. Resist him steadily in faith, knowing that the same sufferings are being experienced by your brethren that are in the world. I think the insight there is to remember that other people have problems too. I have seen individuals from time to time who seem to think that they have special problems. And if you go at life like that, then you are always feeling down because life is not giving you a fair deal like it is to everyone else. Consequently, you are going to be using this as an excuse for your imperfections, and you're going to let them stay that way. As a consequence, those imperfections are going to feed back upon you, and the results are going to be negative for you. So, we are committed to the notion that God watches over each one of us that are His, and we need to remember that the problems that we may be facing are not problems unique to ourselves. Other people face these things as well. Another insight is to do something. Proverbs 13:4 has this to say, "The soul of a lazy person wants, but has nothing. But the soul of the diligent will be satisfied." Each one of us has yearning. We want certain things, and we would like to accomplish certain goals. Now, if we don't do anything, All that will ever happen is the constant yearning. And that will eventually lead itself to self-pity, which also goes along with feeling despondent. A person can think himself into depression. You ever notice that? You can just sit down and think about all the things that are not ideal in your life and all your failures and all the things that people have said that they shouldn't have said. And pretty soon you can be down in the dumps, we call it. Now, if we are going to get ourselves out of this, we've got to do something. Our tendency may be simply to withdraw over into a chair by ourselves. And that's exactly the opposite of what we need to do. We need to take hold of our situation and do something. A lot of times I think we have the feeling that life is a big mountain and we just can't tackle that. It might be helpful for us to remember that jobs seem bigger before we have begun them. And I face this myself sometimes, that jobs seem like impossibilities to tackle. But once I get started in them, then I find out that they sort of melt away. They have a meaner looking face than they really are. And when we tackle them, they tend to disappear in front of us. Another insight then in this matter of doing is to do everything as to the Lord. Paul says this statement in 1 Corinthians 10:31. Whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do everything to the glory of God. He considers that to be a truth that you carry all the way down to eating and drinking. And if that's the case, then many of the things that we have in life ought to be consciously thought of as related to the purposes of God. I think this has an impact upon our sense of wholeness because it unifies life under one total frame of reference. And another thing it does is to give dignity and value to all the activities of life. I'm sure that many times we have the temptation to think, I'm not making much of a contribution. The things that I'm doing are just simple little things, and they're really not all that important. But if we can see that all of life and all the legitimate activities within it can be thought of as being done to the Lord, then it gives us a greater sense of dignity and value. I think also it helps give us a way of sorting out what we ought to be doing. If we cannot do an activity unto the Lord, then perhaps we ought to substitute something else for it. And finally, doing everything to the Lord supplies a positive way of looking at perhaps negative situations. Over in Colossians chapter 3, verses 22 and 23, Paul talks to those who are slaves and says to them that they ought to act not as men pleasers, but as those who do what they do unto the Lord. And when we do that, then perhaps those features of life that we would prefer not to be experiencing are taken hold of in a positive way, and we feel much better about them. In our activity, we need to recognize our limitations, however. Sometimes people have inflated views of themselves and their abilities and what they can accomplish, and as a result, they always feel frustrated because they cannot accomplish the things that they've set out to do. Paul, in fact, has some insight in the 2 Corinthian letter, verses 9 and 10 of chapter 12. He says, I take pleasure in weaknesses, injuries, necessities, persecution, distresses for Christ's sake, because when I am weak, then I am strong. He uses that expression another time before he closes out the epistle. And for a long time, I kind of wondered what he meant by that. How can you be strong by recognizing the fact that you are weak? Now, I don't know that I have a total grasp on what he had in mind, but I see this truth in it. That when we recognize that we do have weaknesses, then we picture ourselves more realistically. And therefore, we are not putting upon ourselves more than we ought to. We are recognizing that there are aspects of our environment that we are not in control of. And there are aspects of history and the ongoing of our lives that are really in other people's hands, or they are in God's hands. And when we recognize our proper place in the mix of all that we participate in, then we have a kind of strength, a strength to deal with whatever may come our way out of those situations. Now, since we are limited and we recognize that, then we will do well to rank things according to importance. The next to the last verse of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6:33 says, "Strive first after God's kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be added to you." When we get a hold of the important things of life, then the other matters tend to take care of themselves. But when we focus on the extras, on the incidentals, that means we're probably letting some central things go that have more long-range effects when they do not work right. And in this statement, Jesus recommends to us to put God's righteousness first, and other things will take care of themselves. He's thinking particularly about shelter and clothes and food and matters of the necessities of life. And when we recognize that God has built us in such a way that we fit into an environment that supplies all of our needs, then it is going to be much more natural for us to relax into our situation, knowing that God has not filled us with any needs that there are not provisions for. I think also you might picture this as like a queen bee. You've seen swarms of bees that gather perhaps on a tree or a bush. If you can find the queen bee, then you can move the whole swarm to where you want it. And life is kind of like that. If you get a hold of God's will, you get a hold of His righteousness, then all the other things that make up the total swarm of life will follow along and take their place. The next verse in the Sermon on the Mount says to reduce life to manageable units. That's what I take it to mean. The words are exactly this: do not worry about tomorrow, because tomorrow will worry about itself. There is enough evil in one day. Perhaps there is nothing more uplifting than to succeed at something. But we do not have that success feeling very often if we pile more and more and more on ourselves than we are able to handle. We're always dealing with these mountains in life. But when we bite off life in manageable chunks, in time or in the difficulty level of our various projects, then we are more likely to be accomplishing the things that we need to accomplish. We can't deal with the whole future right now, but we can deal with the next segment of it and kind of look up once in a while and see where we're going, but work now in the more short-range things in light of the more long-range things. So time-wise and size-wise, we need to handle life in chunks that we can, in fact, manage. And when we spend our time, we need to spend our time and energy on things that will last. In the last chapter of Galatians, Paul makes a statement that really has a lot of applications in chapter 6, when he says that we should not sow to the flesh, because if we sow to the flesh, we will reap corruption. But when we sow to the Spirit, then we reap those things that are of eternal life. There is only so much energy and time that we have. It only makes sense then to concentrate that time and those energies upon the matters that are going to last the longest. We get the greatest productivity out of life when we handle it in that sort of a way. So, I think the implication is that we do not overly invest ourselves in material things, because material things rot away, they rust away, and as in another place in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says that we need to lay up our treasures in heaven, where those kinds of things are not happening to it. I think what Jesus means is that we need to put our attention upon those matters that will last eternally. And very often those are invisible things or intangible things. And we tend to forget about them because perhaps we do not see them. But when we build good relationships with family and friends, and when we commit ourselves to the eternal purposes of God that are invisible, perhaps, in our everyday life, then what we do is going to have a greater long-range effect, and the satisfaction in life is going to be greater as a result of it. In all of this matter of trying to accomplish things, there is another insight that I think is helpful. It has to do with tapping into resources that are beyond ourselves. We only have so much time and energy and other resources. And so, let other people help you with your problems. I think it's helpful to recognize that even Jesus himself, when he was here among us, participating in our nature, wanted his disciples to be around him. The very night of his betrayal, he takes them with him out toward the garden, and three of them especially, he takes on into the inner recesses of that garden and wants them to watch with him, he says. If we draw other people into our projects, into our needs, into our problems, it has the result of giving us greater emotional stability, greater psychological strength. There is no such thing really as a self-made man. All of us need each other. And we do not want to fall into the trap that it makes us look weak if in fact we accept help from other people. It is unreal for us to suppose that we are sufficient of ourselves, because most of the things of life are beyond the sufficiencies that we can provide for them. And so we need to be allowing other people to make whatever contribution they can make to our positive lives. And then we need to trust God to supply our needs. In the Philippian letter, Paul, in the last chapter, talks to those to whom he writes, saying, "My God will supply every need of yours according to his riches in glory in Christ Jesus." He recognizes, in other words, that we have needs and that he has committed himself to providing for them. He's built the world, you might say, in such a way, to a great extent, automatically to take care of the fact that we need to eat and we need clothes and we need shelter and those sorts of things. And we need to trust him to supply those things in our specific situation. And that takes away the worry and the anxiety about life. In a way, I suppose you could look at it as if we are someone else's servants. The master's responsibility is to clothe and feed and shelter us. If we consider ourselves the servants of God, then we look upon him as ultimately the one who takes the responsibility for providing the things that are necessary for our lives. When it comes to problems, I think it is well also to bring in the resources of others. And this time we want to say that we conceive of our problems as given to Christ. In 1 Peter chapter 5, the apostle writes this way, "Humble yourselves under God's mighty hand, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you." A couple other things that we want to say that will give some psychological strength have to do with mental matters. The way we organize in our minds the life that is around us. One insight is to consider difficulties an opportunity for development. Too often we want to shy away from hard things because they don't yield to us easy things. James has an insight in his first chapter, verses 2 through 4, when he says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith works patience. And let patience have its complete work, that you may be complete and entire, lacking in nothing." The specific virtue is that of patience. In a more general way, the writer of the book of Hebrews in chapter 12 has this to say in regard to his advice to people's lives. He says in verse 10, "For a few days our fathers disciplined us as seemed good to them, but he disciplines us for our profit, that we may be partakers of his holiness." And so, in behaving ourselves, we gain a kind of strength that will help us deal with the difficulties of life. Another mental matter is that of thinking about wholesome things. And perhaps the nicest verse in the Scripture in this regard is in the 4th chapter of Philippians and in verse 8. The writer says, "Whatever is true, honorable, just, pure, lovely, worth praising, if there is any virtue, any praise, think on these things." In other words, if we use the power of positive thinking, it's going to have a great effect upon our outlook on life. And we need to dwell upon the wholesome things. And then in 1 Corinthians 13:7, the statement is that love bears all things. Practice caring for other people, and it will give you a kind of strength that I think is helpful. And in general, we want to say, obey Christ. There is a correlation between our nature and God's commandments to us. Don't expect to be healthy and well-adjusted while disobeying God's will, because many times our disobedience is simply working against the very nature that we have. So, we are able to have a kind of strength before God by virtue of keeping His Word and dealing with all those things that He says to us in our daily lives, so that we end up being a praise to Him and strength to others as well as ourselves. Emotions are a very real part of our lives, and we all have to deal with them on a daily basis. And there are a number of them: pressure, worry, a sense of anxiety, fear, stress, hate, love, prejudice, joy, sadness, despair, depression, dread, discouragement, boredom, sense of low morale, even jealousy, anger, even a guilt complex. We have this many and more feelings bombarding us daily. It becomes very important for us to be able to manage those in such a way that our relationships with other people live a little bit too much by their emotions. And that's not a good thing. They will maybe determine what the truth of things is by how they feel about them, or they will make decisions on the basis of their feelings, and maybe even measure honesty and dishonesty by how they feel. The reason I think emotions are not good is that sometimes they make matters bigger than they really are. The way we feel does not have to correspond in importance to the size of that real experience that we have out there. We blow things out of proportion, we say. Emotions even transfer themselves from objects to something else besides the source of them. And I think we've all had experiences in our home where, let's say, a husband comes home tired and worn out. He has a discussion with his wife that turns out to be not especially even keel. She feels aggravated by all of that and then takes it out on the kids. Normally, if at supper time one of the kids would have spilled a small glass of milk or something, it wouldn't have bothered her that much. But this time, she really gets after the little guy because he spilled his milk. Really what she's doing is transferring her sense of anger toward her husband to something else besides her husband. And we do that kind of thing all the time, and as a result, emotions get us into trouble. Emotions are also many times just plain wrong. They are not legitimate ways of feeling in light of what has happened. And emotions change so often. You can feel so much different about things in the morning than you felt the night before when you went to bed. Or maybe next week, things will seem entirely different. from the way they appeared when you were originally in some sort of an experience with other people. Now, since they can be such a detriment to us, we need to make sure that we understand how we can manage them appropriately. And there are ways by which people deal with their emotions. Sometimes they're helpful and sometimes they're not. One of the things we tend to do is let them go, just sort of release. And you hear people saying, I just need to explode, especially when it comes to matters like anger or frustration. Well, when they do that, they may have caused more damage than they did good by getting this emotional feel of anger off their chest, because they may have hurt someone else's feelings. And if they've let their actions fly, they may have ruined something in the house just because they were trying to deal with their emotions by getting rid of them and expressing them or letting them go. Now, the opposite extreme is perhaps even worse, that of stifling our emotions. Sometimes we hide them from other people just to make sure that they don't know that we feel depressed or anxious or fearful. And when we do that, we perhaps even carry it to the point where we hide them from ourselves. And that creates unresolved anger and unresolved guilt and unresolved fear. And it's not a healthy kind of a thing to carry around with us all the time. Instead of those kinds of extremes, it seems that we ought to be trying to do things that will curb our emotions. Would be one way to look at it, where it's not that you stifle them, and it's not that you just let them explode, but you express them in acceptable degrees. Or perhaps even better, if they are emotions that should not be expressed, maybe you need to change them, especially if they are inappropriate ways of reading an experience. We need to figure out ways of responding to such experiences without doing something destructive. Now, we're assuming here then that in suggesting that feelings can be changed, that is in fact what can happen. And I believe that the Scripture leads us to believe that in fact emotions can be handled, managed, and even changed. God gives us commandments that have to do with our feelings, and one of them that comes to mind is in the book of Ephesians, chapter 4 and verse 26. Paul says, "Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath." Now, in order for us to be obeying that, we have to put some kind of control upon the feeling of anger. I think the force of the passage is, if you are angry, don't let that thing dwell in your mind and continue to grow and fester. Don't continue to nurse it day in and day out. Put closure on it after a while. Evidently, we are able to do that. So, it would appear then that our emotions, including anger, is something that we can manage and curb and control, or God would not make such commandments to us. Now, if all of this is the case, the importance of emotions, the likelihood that they can be destructive, we want to spend some time talking about general formulas that we can have in our minds for managing our emotions. Now, in order to introduce the two ways that primarily we're going to be talking about, we have made a diagram here on the board behind us. If we look at a situation that has emotion in it, normally what has happened is that we've had an experience. Let's call that an event. Something has occurred. We make an interpretation of that event. Sometimes that's rather automatic. Out of our interpretation, certain feelings arise, certain emotions, such as what we have already mentioned. And those, in turn, lead to specific ways of acting that flow from the feelings that are based on the interpretation which we have made of the event. Now, in order to get a feel for what we're going to try to be doing with this, let's use a simple illustration. Let's say you're walking down the hall and you see someone coming that you'd like to talk to, and so as you're walking along, you slow down and you say hi, and you are anticipating striking up a short conversation with the person. Now, he simply says hi, but keeps on going. All right, now that is the experience in and of itself. Now the question is, what do you do with that? One of the things that you will probably do with it, or find yourself doing from time to time, is to feel hurt by that. And as a consequence, then, that will lead to some behaviors. If you see that person again sometime, you might be so offended by the previous encounter that you won't even speak. Or sometimes we talk about people crossing the street and going down the other side. If they see someone up ahead, sometimes we'll start avoiding the person. That's another behavior that grows out of the feelings we have had generated in us by the experience itself. Now, people get into habits when they encounter experiences like this, and their habits can even extend to the matter of emotion. Emotions can become habits or habitual ways of dealing with situations. And so we say if we're going to change our emotions, then there are a couple things that we need to keep in mind about how to change them that are like changing habits. One thing is you have to bring this whole matter to the conscious level. You have to realize what you're doing. And the other is that you have to substitute some other behavior in place of that habit in order to get rid of the practice of it so it's not reinforced from time to time. Now, these two facets of dealing with habits correspond with the two basic ways we want to talk about in dealing with emotions. Now, in this diagram again, we have had the experience and we've made an interpretation of it. Now, right there is something we need to stop and focus on, because often we make automatic responses to our experiences without realizing that there is a distinction between what we have seen in them and what is really there to see. We sometimes take things personally, when, as a matter of fact, when the other person has said something, he didn't mean it as a comment against us and our person. He was simply making a statement. But we get in the habit of automatically taking things as criticisms of ourselves, for instance. So the first main thing we need to do is make a distinction between what we can call the objective experience or event itself and how that impacts us, the interpretation that we put upon that event. If we're going to be changing our feelings, perhaps one of the important things for us then to do is to go back and reevaluate our tendency toward interpreting events in certain ways. And when we reinterpret what those things were and how they were meant, what motives they were involved in the other person's comments, this will have an effect of changing for good the feelings that we have had in connection with such experiences. Sometimes that person, in the illustration where we pass in the hall, it was not disinterested in talking to us, perhaps. It's just that he was preoccupied with something else, and he didn't even notice that you were slowing down to talk with him. Or perhaps he was in a hurry and needed to get somewhere, and you did not notice that he was moving along in a rather quick fashion as if he was trying to head someplace. So what you do in a case like that is to say, what right do I have to interpret his actions as if they were meant as a cut toward me, or if he was trying to avoid me, or something like that? Now, there are a couple other things that we can do at the interpretation level of our experiences that will have a good impact upon our feelings. One is that when we have an experience, there is often a combination of positive and negative elements within it. We can look consciously for the good that occurs in them, and by concentrating on that, our feelings will be influenced in a way that will be much more satisfying to us. We can get in the habit of dwelling upon the negative elements of a circumstance. Another thing that we can do is imagine how the situation can be worse. we've heard the illustration used probably of a person who felt sorry for himself because he had no shoes until he saw someone who had no feet. And it can be a kind of a mental process that we go through by simply looking at a circumstance and saying, things could be a lot worse than they are here, and I need to be glad that they are not any worse than they are. Another thing is that we can just get out of the habit of running everything through a good-bad evaluation system. Not everything is necessarily to be evaluated good and bad, or we are not always in a very good position to evaluate things as to good or bad. We can simply take them and make no value judgments upon them. Perhaps they were bad, but if we simply take them without the coloring of good versus bad, then we can always make up our minds later as to which way it was, if it is in fact all that necessary for us to make that evaluation at all. Now, these are different, perhaps related ways of dealing at the interpretation level so as to affect our feelings. Now, there is another side to this as well, and that is working from the behavior end back upon the feelings. If we use the illustration again about passing someone in the hall, perhaps as a matter of fact, that person was shunning you. Maybe he didn't want to talk to you. Maybe he didn't think you were all that important. Now, you can say to yourself in that kind of a situation, something that has to do with interpretation, that's just plain dumb. He has no right to feel that way. Or you can say, I'll change. There are probably some things about me that cause him to feel that way and therefore to act that way toward me. So I will change those things that have created that kind of a feeling in him. So we choose to act in different ways that will have an effect upon the way we feel about those circumstances. It's my conviction that our feelings are very much affected by the way we act, and sometimes our actions are the best avenue toward changing our feelings. It is easier to use our will upon an action than it is to use our will upon a feeling. You can will to do something different a lot easier than you can will to feel different. So we use our will then upon the mind in the first case, so far as interpretation is concerned. Now we're thinking about using our will to change the actions. And there is a statement that Paul makes in the 12th chapter of the book of Romans, verses 17 through 21, that I think has an implication for us in talking about using action as a way to shape our feelings. Paul says, "Render to no one evil for evil. Take thought for things honorable in the sight of all men. If it is possible, as much as lies in you, be at peace with all men. Do not avenge yourselves, brothers, but give place to wrath, for it is written, 'Vengeance belongs to me, I will repay, says the Lord.' But if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For in so doing, you will heap coals of fire on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." Now, Paul is talking about a larger thing than what we're looking at this passage for. He's talking about changing the evil that may be in our circumstance by a certain way of acting toward it. That is, by returning good for the evil first expressed to us. In our illustration about passing someone in the hall, instead then of our feeling put down and our therefore feeling frustrated or angry or refused, rejected, what we can do is go ahead and make maybe an extra effort to be helpful to that sort of a person or to be agreeable to him. As a result, we will not be overcome by the evil, but we will have a tendency to overcome that evil in him by acting in good ways toward Him. Now, if we're acting that way toward Him, we're not only going to be changing Him, we're going to be mastering and curbing our own feelings in order to do that. So, it seems to me that by using our actions in specific cases like this, we can change the feelings that would otherwise have been generated and perhaps held on to for a while by that experience. Now, in a much more general way, we can also talk about using our actions to change feelings. Put our formula to work saying you can't will to feel other than frustrated very well. And you can't will not to feel bored. But what you can do more easily is to will to do something. And when you get out and get to doing that, create new feelings. So in general, the active life is going to be helpful to us in overcoming some of these senses of frustration, boredom, anxiety, depression, and all of that. Now we can look for a little bit here at some specific activities that we can do for managing our emotions. Most of the activities that we recommended in our previous session on psychological strength would have a bearing here as well. Those were particularly designed to talk about maintaining desirable emotions. Here, maybe we can concentrate a little bit more on those activities that will change undesirable ones and will help retrieve us from specific experiences that send us into a tailspin, perhaps we could say. One of these is the matter of getting some physical exercise. Now, interestingly, there is a comment in the Scripture in this regard when Paul says to Timothy in the first letter, chapter 4, verse 8, bodily exercise is profitable for a little. Some translations will put it, bodily exercise profits little, but either way, if it profits little, it profits that much. And I'm not sure what all Paul may have had in mind, but there are some things that I've noticed in my own experience about physical exercise. Sometimes it's helpful just to do something very exhausting. Go out and jog, go out and chop wood, go out and use a shovel, go out and work hard in the garden. When I was on the farm, we used to haul a lot of hay, and we used pitchforks to throw the hay, and to throw the bales, we get a hold of the strings, and we worked all day, and it's good for you. Exhaustive physical exercise has a way of getting rid of tension and frustration, and even anger can be helped by this. Not only a general pattern of being a physically active person, but sometimes we just have things dumped on us and we're not aware that they're going to happen at all. In circumstances like that, if we can, it is very helpful just to go out and work yourself for a long time at something physical that will tire you. A friend of ours was laid off from his job, and I just happened to notice that that same afternoon, not long after we had heard about his being retired, his being laid off from his job, his wife was out jogging. Now, I suppose she did that other times, but I had never noticed it before. And I rather suspect what she was doing was dealing with the frustration, the disappointment, and all of that by getting out and doing something physical that would have the effect of getting over this sluggishness, this frustration and so on that we can otherwise experience without physical exercise. Watch what we eat is another thing that is helpful. Some things especially are more dangerous for us. Sugar is one of those things that we are finding now that has an awful lot of an effect upon the way we feel, especially if we have a tendency toward being hypoglycemic. Too much sugar makes us feel morose and sad and down in the dumps a lot, and if we limit the amount of sugar intake that we have, it will help us a whole lot. Another matter is getting some sleep. I teach in a college, and it's interesting to watch how young people go about life. They have a tendency just to work until they drop. They'll stay up all night studying, or maybe not studying, and then wonder why the next day they really feel out of it. They don't have a very high motivational level, and all of those things that just keep them down. Well, they may not even realize it, but their lack of sleep has had a lot to do with the way they are feeling. And so physical things are very important for our emotional well-being, as well also as a time to relax and a time for leisure. We need to plan time for relaxing. There's nothing particularly wrong with that. I know you can carry it too far, but even Jesus himself found an occasion or two when we see, at least in the record of his life, a need for getting out and getting away from the pressure of the crowds. Up near the Sea of Galilee, it's recorded in Mark chapter 6, verse 31, that Jesus says to his disciples, "Come aside into a desert place and rest a while." And the text explains, "For there were many coming and going, and they had no leisure so much as even to eat." So we can take some time for ourselves. If it's just a matter of pulling up to the window and watching it rain or watching it snow or watching the wind blow, perhaps you can watch the creek run, maybe watch the fire in the fireplace burn or at a campfire. My oldest son David likes fish that you can put in an aquarium, and he likes to sit and just watch them swim around in there. It's relaxing to him. That's what hobbies are for. Sometimes music can be a helpful thing to us to soothe our nerves or perhaps to lift our spirits. And we think about the illustration in the Old Testament where Saul called upon David as a young harpist to come and play for him, to help him when he was attacked by these moods of extreme depression. Breaking routine is a helpful way of dealing with our emotions sometimes, and it's important for mothers with young children to get away from the continual responsibility that they might feel about them. Maybe daddy can take them and deal with them for an hour or two or more. Maybe the two of them can find another friend to stay with the kids, and they can go out and just spend some time with each other. But breaking the routine can be very helpful here. That's related to the matter of finding something new. Variety in life helps us stay up on top of things in a way that is very helpful. We need often to talk to positive people. And this is true just in a general way. If we keep to ourselves a lot, we open ourselves up more to the feeling of depression. If we have problems in those circumstances, we tend to run them over, recycle them in our minds. And each time we run them through, the groove is a little deeper, and we feel a little bit more impressed by the sadness of the whole thing. And we need, in general, to avoid complainers. Complainers are more harmful to us than their bodily presence, so to speak, can be helpful. By complaining, a lot of people try to really give an excuse for not trying harder, and sometimes it's just a way of getting attention or perhaps controlling the mood of the situation, but we need to stay away from them. But in specific cases, when we are faced with problems, it's very helpful to go to someone and talk. Maybe talk about anything, but specifically be able to talk about that particular matter. Talking about matters seems to make them much more manageable. It masters them. It tends even to clarify them, and you have the feel that you are getting rid of it by putting it out here where you can look at it and getting it away from yourself. That's really what counselors primarily are doing. Sometimes we can't talk to other people, but we can talk to God. And talking out loud with our eyes open manage our emotions. So our emotions are things that are really great for us, but they can also be a great detriment, and we do not need to be controlled by them. We need to be able to manage them. Strengthening the will is one of the more complex issues that we have been dealing with in this series of studies called Basic Christianity. The reason it's so complex is that so many features feed into that which makes us able to carry on the activities that we want to do. So we're going to try to organize these as best we can in this study so that we can outline the various contributing factors to the strength of will. And once perhaps we understand that, maybe we can do a better job of getting ourselves to do what we know we ought to do. There's quite a range of terms that are associated with our concern here. We talk about will, we talk about choice, volition, motivation, willingness, self-discipline, wanting to. And the thing that makes this all the more complex is that we're concerned with the matter of the will as it has to do with the practical situations of life, not just as a theoretical study of some sort. So it blends off into some of the other areas that are closely associated with the will. Now, we talk a lot about the freedom of the will. And all the more is it important then for us to understand the relationship of freedom of the will to what we're talking about here in the strengthening of the will. When we talk about freedom, we don't mean that every action is as easy to do as every other action, nor do we mean that past failure has no effect on present resolve. In fact, that is the problem. Though we have a sense of the ability to choose and the sense of the ability to get into an action we know we ought to do, still we find that it is not as easy to do that as we would like for it to be. And because of that, Paul words the frustration of his own experience in Romans 7 when he says he'd like to do a lot of things that he can't get himself to do, and some things he doesn't want to, he ends up doing anyway. So our tendency may be to feel, in fact, that emotions and will and maybe even our conscience sort of operate on their own and do whatever they please. Now, our conviction is that whereas emotion and will and conscience do tend to be that way, there are many things that we can do to help and assist them in becoming what they ought to be. We're going to be talking in general throughout this study about sources of motivation, and mixed in with that, we're going to be talking about some techniques that we can use that are really simple and down to earth that will help us have a stronger experience with our will. In general, we want to observe that when we're talking about the will, we're talking about the relationship of our values to our actions. To a great extent, then, the values that we have in our mind are connected with the actions that we would perform by the will. And so it is important for us to see that motivation corresponds with a set of values as the will connects those values with our actions. Now, there are some things that help us in performing this connection between values and action, and one of them is clarity. Now, that's a simple idea, I believe. We don't want to forget it, however. The clearer our choice is, the easier it is for us to get ourselves to do it. Not long ago, I had a problem with our car. It was missing, wasn't running right, and I don't know too much about mechanics. And I put that off and put that off and finally tried to do something about it. But if I had known more exactly what was causing the problem, I could have gotten myself more easily into the activity of finding out what was causing it not to run right. As it ended up, I turned it over to a mechanic and had to pay a good bit of money to get it fixed just because I didn't know for sure what it was that I needed to do. If we are clear as to what it is, then our motivation will be better for actually doing it. And a related idea is that of certainty. Now, we're talking here about whether it is true or not. It's not a matter of clarity exactly. It's a matter of how sure we are that what we're thinking about is true. That means something along the line of what is involved in the Hebrews statement when he says, "He that comes to God must believe that he exists." We will not be putting out a lot of effort if we do not believe there is a God out there to draw near to. And that's true then with a lot of other things. If we are certain that we are right, and if we're certain that an action is correct, then it'll be a lot easier for us to get into the action itself. A third idea associated with the mind that serves as a source for motivation is the matter of duty. A duty we don't always talk about a lot. It's not perhaps the most glamorous thing. Duty sounds a little cold and all of that. But we do need to remember that we can have a sense of duty. And because of that sense of duty, our wills may be moved along a little better. Recently, my wife had to have an operation for appendicitis. And so we took her in late one evening, and she was operated on in the wee hours of the morning. And usually that's considered major surgery, and persons are laid up for several weeks before they're completely healed. That little gal was back in the classroom within a week, starting to do some of her responsibilities as a teacher. And I think she's an example of someone who has a high sense of duty, and she has developed that in connection with the values that she has set up in her life, and consequently she can will herself and be strong-willed with respect to those kinds of things. Now, in connection with clarity, certainty, and duty, we can suggest, I believe, a technique, and it's a simple one. It's simply this: study and think. When we study the Scripture and when we think about what it means, then we'll be clearer as to what we're supposed to do. We'll be more certain that it is the right thing to do, and we will have a greater sense of moral obligation, of duty, to fulfill it. And that is true not only with biblical matters, but I think it's also true with other aspects of life besides the religious ones. Now, we've been talking primarily about what the mind as an area can contribute as individual sources of motivation. Let's move now to another general area, and that is emotion. My conviction is that to a great extent, we do in fact act out of our emotions. Now, it may not always be the most ideal thing, but that is, a matter of fact, the way we tend to operate. If our feelings are into the action, then we can get ourselves more easily able to do that. And so I have tried to capture on this diagram something of this idea by putting motion down here with a large arrow pointing into will. And if we can feed the emotion, the feeling, the want-to aspect of ourselves, then that will have an effect on strengthening our individual choices to go ahead and do what we ought to do. The desire itself, then, is part of what we can call the will. Now, there is a problem that we want to try to avoid in this connection, and that is that the will is, or the emotion is in some sort of a way an ultimate frame of reference on its own, and we have to make our choices and so on and carry out our will in conformity to that. I've even heard people try to argue that if you do things when you really don't want to, you're being a hypocrite. And we've tried to solve that a little bit by drawing an arrow from mind down to emotions to suggest to us that our emotions need to be fed by the values that lie behind them. And really, hypocrisy then needs to be understood in terms of mind rather than in terms of feelings. It's not a matter then of saying things and doing things that are contrary to the way we sort of feel about them. Hypocrisy is a matter of saying things and doing things that are contrary to our beliefs, actually. So we're not trying to suggest hypocrisy. We're simply trying to suggest that our emotions need to be curbed and controlled by our understanding. So desire is one of these sources of motivation that we can play on to help us get into the actions we need to perform. The next one we're going to suggest, associated with emotion, is perhaps surprising, and that is the idea of guilt. Now, normally we think of guilt as a negative thing, and most of the time it is. It's not something, at least, that we want to experience. But guilt can be helpful to us in motivation if it is done ahead of action. The problem with guilt is that after we have done something, then the guilt sets in and tends to destroy us. But when we think ahead of time of what we do and realize how we will feel if we go ahead and do what is not right for us to do, then it will help curb our behavior in that kind of a situation. So we can play upon the idea of guilt to help us avoid certain kind of actions that we ought not to do, or perhaps to get ourselves to go on and do things we should because we'll feel guilty if we do not carry them on through. This brings us then to another general area, and that is the area of action. On this chart, we have connected up the will, mind, and action with the emotions. My conviction is that when we do things, that action itself has an impact upon the way we do. Consequently, since the actions that we are calling upon ourselves to be strong about are good actions, there ought to be good experiences coming out of most of them. That will help us have a greater sense of want to, feeding the emotions that will then strengthen the will into further activity. In other words, then, one of the ways that we can strengthen our will is by simply exercising it, and when we do it, the enjoyment of the activity itself will tend to keep it going. And so another source of motivation is the enjoyment of the actual good things and good actions of life itself. This also associates itself with a technique that we can add in here, and that is a simple idea of get started. Now, in certain situations, we may not have enough motivation or feel that we have enough strength of will to get into the whole activity as we may see that total job laid out. We don't have to do the whole thing. All we have to do is get started in the activity. When we get started then, if it's wholesome, it will tend to push us on along, and the wholesomeness and the enjoyment of the experience itself will help us continue until we have finished it. I believe this particular mechanism is helpful with procrastination. Putting things off gets to be a habit that is dangerous, and we never get around to getting started into things. If we can only get started, many times the experience will kind of carry us along after we have begun. Associated also with action is the matter of association. Now, this is kind of an idea close to what we've just now been talking about. It may be that you know that you ought to be doing certain kinds of things because you have the skills, you have the awareness that it is possible for you to do that. But you just can't seem to get yourself to do it. The idea here is that you might get yourself started doing things that are related to that activity, even though it's not the activity itself. And as a result of being involved around the activity, you will have a strength enough of the will to begin it. An example might be that you know that you perhaps have the ability and skill to be a Sunday school teacher, but every time they come around to speak to you about working in that area, you just can't quite get yourself to do it. It might be that you could go on and work as a teacher's helper and get in the circumstance, become acquainted with the activity, get an interest developed in it that will help you want to do it, and then you will find it a lot easier to will yourself into that activity. So a technique that would go with this would be will indirectly. By virtue of getting associated with the total enterprise, you develop a liking for it, and you will get yourself further involved. A couple other things quickly here is a matter of variety in action. Sometimes doing the same thing day in and day out and over years and years perhaps gets us a little dried out on it. If we have different kinds of things that we can weave into our lives, it helps keep it a lot fresher. And when we feel fresh and new, it's easier for us to get ourselves into gear. Sometimes having a hobby is helpful, or taking a vacation, or finding some sort of a way to change the scenery a little bit will help us move ourselves along. Final consideration of source in connection with action is our physical condition. Now, we could have had another chart here that would include the body along with the will and emotion, but I think we're primarily concerned with action here because there are some things that we can do with our body that will keep us from being lethargic and dull and not really very much with it. Plenty of exercise and a proper diet, proper rest will help us feel that we want to get in and do things. There are days when perhaps because we have not rested enough, we do not really have quite the zest we should have, and it makes it awfully hard for us to get into those things that we should want to do. The problem that might surface at this particular point, since we have been talking so much about doing things because we want to and therefore feeding the want to by our actions, is what happens if the actions are not enjoyable actions and the experience of the actions themselves is not a sort of a self-fulfilling experience. What do you do then? Well, we might remember that mind and understanding have a component that they can put into the picture, but we can go on to our next general area, and that is look at results. When we do actions, not only are the actions involved, but the actions kick up further consequences. And often it is that these results feed back onto our emotions. And perhaps we are not particularly caught up in the actions themselves, but we do desire the results that are coming from what we have to do. Consequently, the end effect is a strengthening of the will with respect to those kinds of things. Good actions yield peaceable fruits, perhaps we could say. And if we appeal to the 11th chapter of Hebrews again, verse 7 says, "He that comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those that diligently seek him." So rewards is one of these consequences that we can have to our actions. My own sons have done a lot of lawn mowing and so on ever since they were halfway through school. And just by adding together a few dollars here and a few dollars there, they've been able to collect enough money that they've bought their own musical instruments. And I was talking to one of my sons the other day. He has about $1,300 wrapped up in some fine horns that he can now use. Well, the activity on a hot day of mowing the grass, maybe 3 or 4 lawns in one afternoon, may not have been that fulfilling an experience in itself, but the effects of that was pay that enabled him then to buy things that was a fulfilling experience to be involved in. Success is another thing that is related to this. We say success begets success, and I think that's because of when we do things and we find out that we can accomplish something when we do them, we are more prone to get back into the activity and be more motivated to try it and to continue it the next time. Fear is another result, another source that we can tie into, I think, for motivating ourselves. Perhaps it's not the most ideal thing, but it is a very real factor of life. When we think about various results of our actions, there are certain fears that we need to remember. There are bad consequences to certain actions. There are bad consequences to not doing certain things. And if we can remember them, then it will help us a good bit in moving ourselves toward the activity. This suggests to me another technique, which we'll simply call obligate yourself. We need to go ahead and put ourselves into situations that will force us to produce and compel us to carry through on our activity. If we get ourselves into them once and get started, then the demands of the situation itself will help carry us along, and the fear of not fulfilling our roles and responsibilities will then also aid us in accomplishing the good things of life. Now, this is true both to circumstances in general and also in relation to other persons. And we want to move to that next area then when we talk about the impact that things can have upon our motivations. We've talked about the actions themselves and the results and the wanting to part. And this kind of forms a circle around ourselves individually. But I believe that one of the most important components of motivation is to tie into the resources that other people can give us in this way. They have certain values that we share with them, and that's the reason that we as Christian people have associated ourselves with them. And so they can reinforce in us and provoke in us love and good works, as the Hebrew writer says again. They contribute to our strength of activity and consistency and behavior that is in conformity with our values by virtue of the very fact that they are there. And there are three different ways that are associated together that I believe come out of this possibility that other persons have for us. Love, trust, and hope. Love, perhaps, is the greatest motivator. When you know that someone cares about you, then that really has a strong effect upon your ability to get into the actions that ought to be performed by you and actions that carry out the values that you share with these other people. As a result of love, trust is created. When other people love us and they express that love to us, then we begin to trust them. And this elaborates the ability of others to help us in our activities. And the Scripture talks a lot about hope and the importance of that. And I believe that that ultimately is associated with persons too. Persons who love us cause us to trust them. And when there is trust in the world, then the result is hope. And that is true with respect to God and with respect to other people, because we know that we can count on their carrying through unto the end. Now, I've been looking at this in the matter of other people loving us and our, therefore, being able to trust them and have hope. This can be turned around the other way, too, I believe. And that is that when we love other people, we have a greater motivation to do those things that are appropriate to do in fellowship and in relationship with them. Now, there are a couple things that people can rely on in the expression of love and creating a trust and hope in us. They have speech and they have their example. And just as an example of this speech matter, the whole book of Hebrews is summed up in the 13th chapter, verse 22, by calling itself a word of exhortation. And I find myself in this matter of will and perseverance and hanging in there and doing what we ought to do, coming again and again to the book of Hebrews. And I think the reason is that book was written with the intention of helping people strengthen their will to do what they ought to do in the face of other things. And so this word of exhortation. But the example of other people, and like the 11th chapter of that book, is important as well. And Paul notes in the first chapter of Philippians that those who had seen how he dealt with his imprisonment and his trials in connection with that were emboldened to speak the word of God. So when we are put in association with other persons, then what they say to us, how they encourage us verbally, and the example that they set around us is very important. This leads to a couple techniques that I think we can mention in connection with other people. One is fellowship. We need to put ourselves around other people. This is the connector between our individual sources of motivation and that source of motivation that lies in other people. We make the choice to put ourselves in the particular sets of people that we put ourselves in. And when we look around and find those who share our values and our beliefs and our commitments, then we may not be as strong as we ought to be, but it helps for us simply to know by putting ourselves in those connections and fellowshipping with them that we will be provoked to love and good works. I think that's why the mission of the 12 and of the 70, as recorded in the Gospels, was carried out in a 2-by-2 fashion, because people going out together can reinforce each other's commitments to do the things that are important. The sixth technique that we can mention is that of praying. Prayer is something that brings other persons, specifically God, into the picture of our lives. Philippians chapter 2, verse 12 has this to say, "Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, For it is God that works in you, both to will and to work for His good pleasure. God is able to work in our circumstance and to provide that kind of input which will then impact us and help us move in the directions that we ought to move. And so we can, shall we say, plug into that source of motivation by asking Him to help us do the things that we ought to do. A similar idea is expressed in Paul in the 2 Thessalonian letter, verse 5 of chapter 3. May the Lord direct your hearts into the love of God. In other words, we are moved by the Lord Himself into a greater appreciation for Him and for His purposes in the world. There is a popular song that says, if you don't have a willing heart, ask Him to give you one, which sums up rather simply the idea that the Lord is one who is available for among the others that are out there to draw on, to give us a greater sense and a greater strength of the will to fulfill the tasks that lie before us. There are important variables in motivation that we want to mention here quickly as we come down toward the end of our study. One is the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is a motivation that arises out of the very activity itself. Extrinsic motivations are those that do not have a particular association with the activity itself, as for instance grades as we go to school. The experiential and goal orientation. The experiential would be those kinds of things that come right out of the doing itself, whereas hope and reward and success look on down the line. There's positive and negative motivation, as in love and trust on the one hand, or fear and guilt and perhaps duty on the other. Then there's the matter of internal and external center of control. And Christians need a balance between the internal initiative and the external input into their lives. And finally, I think it is important for us to remember our general context of relationship to persons, because it is persons that give us the greatest source of motivation and strengthening of the will.